Nobody's coming for you in that ambulance, Dad. We're not paying for a hero complex. She laughed when she said it, not loud, just enough for the nurse standing 3 feet away to hear it too, and for the man in Bay 4 behind the curtain, flat on a gurney with an IV taped into the back of his hand, to hear it as well. I was 70 years old. I had spent 38 years inside that hospital, most of them on the other side of a scalpel. And now I was on a gurney in the same building, listening to my only child decide out loud in front of strangers that I could wait. 3 hours later, at 2:52 in the morning, a man named Marcus Whitlow walked through the automatic doors of that hospital carrying a leather folder he'd kept in a locked drawer for 22 years. He didn't say a word to Priya. He didn't need to. By sunrise, she would know exactly whose name was carved quietly into the foundation of the wing she was standing in. She just didn't know it yet. Neither did I, honestly, know how far she'd let things slide before that night. I need to back up. Bear with me. This takes a minute to get to properly. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable. This one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. My name is Desmond Okafor. I retired in the fall of 2019 after 38 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon. The last 26 of them at the same hospital where, on a Tuesday night in March, my own heart decided it had done enough favors for other people's chests and wanted a turn. I live on Grandin Road in Hyde Park, in a 2-story brick house I bought in 1987 with a resident's salary and a loan I paid off 9 years early out of spite for the interest rate. I still drive a 2009 Buick LeSabre with cloth seats and a tape deck I've never removed, mostly because I still have 4 Nina Simone tapes and no good reason to replace a working car. Every Tuesday morning at 8:15, I walk 4 blocks to a coffee shop called Sydney's on Erie Avenue and order 1 drip coffee, black, no room. Bethany, who works the counter, gave up asking if I want anything else sometime around 2022. I lost my wife, Adayeze, in June of 2021. Congestive heart failure, the same organ system I'd spent my career fixing in other people. And there is a particular kind of quiet that comes with knowing your training and your hands were no use to you in your own kitchen at 11 at night. I don't talk about that part much. I didn't talk about it at all, actually, until this past March forced my hand. The house on Grandin Road has 4 bedrooms and, most nights, one occupied one. I keep Adayeze's reading glasses on the nightstand on her side, not out of some morbid ritual, just because moving them felt like a decision I wasn't ready to make. My daughter Priya used to call every Sunday when her mother was alive. Adayeze was the one who kept the family calendar running, birthdays, appointments, the small administrative glue that holds people together without anyone noticing it's there. After she died, the calls thinned out to maybe twice a month. Then, by this past winter, to whenever Priya needed something confirmed, a recipe, an address, a signature. I noticed. I didn't say anything. There's a particular kind of pride that keeps a man from telling his daughter he misses her voice. What almost nobody in my life knew, including my daughter, is that for 22 years I had been the sole anonymous donor behind a cardiac care fund at that hospital, structured through my attorney, Marcus Whitlow, so that my name never touched a single document that a family member, a colleague, or a tax preparer could ever stumble across. I didn't do it to be modest. I did it because the first time I gave money to that hospital, right after we lost our second daughter as an infant in 1994, a board member thanked me at a dinner party in front of 40 people, and I hated every second of being thanked more than I've hated almost anything in my life. So, I made sure it never happened again. Her name was Ngozi. She lived 6 days, a congenital heart defect nobody caught on the prenatal scans, the kind that sometimes slips past even careful doctors, which was its own particular cruelty given what I did for a living. Adayeze never fully recovered from those 6 days, not in any way you could put a name to on a chart. She threw herself into hospital volunteer work instead, rocking premature infants in the NICU 2 mornings a week for the next 26 years, right up until her own heart gave out. Priya knew she'd had a sister who died young. She did not know how much of her mother's life, and eventually mine, had been quietly built around that loss, funneled into a fund neither of us ever discussed at the dinner table. That fund had a name. I'll get to it. My daughter Priya is 41. She's a marketing director for a regional retail company, married to a man named Derek Chen, who runs a startup that has, by my count, raised 2 rounds of funding and profit in neither of them. They live in a rented townhouse in Mount Adams with a view Derek likes to photograph for his business page. I say this without cruelty. I say it because it matters to what happened next. For about 3 years, ever since Derek's company started running into trouble, I noticed something shift in how Priya talked about me. Not cruelly at first, just carefully, like I'd become a line item she was managing instead of a father she was calling. The first time I really felt it was a Sunday in November at her house over a dinner she'd clearly planned for Derek's business partners rather than for family. Someone asked what I did before I retired, and before I could answer, Priya said, "Oh, he was a doctor, nothing too glamorous," and moved the conversation along like she was changing a slide in a presentation. I let it go. You let a lot of things go when you've buried a wife and a daughter and you've decided the family you have left is worth more than your pride. There's a glass of water I still think about from that dinner, sitting in front of my plate because Priya had quietly told the caterer no wine for her father without asking me first. I sat at the far end of the table watching Derek's business partners nod politely through a conversation about supply chain financing that none of them seemed to fully understand either. I drove home that night on Columbia Parkway with the windows down even though it was November because something about that dinner had left the inside of my chest feeling smaller than usual. At the time I chalked it up to hurt feelings. I didn't know yet it was the early architecture of what would put me in an ambulance 4 months later. The second time was in January. I had a standing cardiology follow-up, the kind you don't skip at 70 with my history, and Priya had told me 3 weeks earlier, she'd drive me because my own cardiologist had quietly suggested I not drive myself to appointments where they might dilate my eyes or adjust medication same day. 2 days before the appointment, she texted, "Can't do Thursday. Work's insane. Can you just Uber?" I could have. I did. I sat in the waiting room 40 minutes early because the driver was early, and I didn't tell her that either. I sat there next to a woman probably in her 80s whose son had walked her in himself, coat over his arm, phone nowhere in sight. And I remember feeling something uncomfortably close to envy toward a stranger, which isn't an emotion I'm particularly proud of admitting now, but it's the truth, and this story doesn't work if I only tell the flattering parts of it. There was a fourth moment too, one I didn't understand the weight of until much later. In late February, Priya called on a Thursday night, which was unusual enough on its own, and after 10 minutes of small talk asked, almost too carefully, whether I'd ever thought about downsizing, maybe moving somewhere smaller, somewhere that made more sense for someone living alone. She used the word asset once, describing the Grandin Road house, the way you'd describe a stock position rather than the place her mother died. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. She said, "Okay, just thinking about you," and the call ended 9 minutes after it started. I sat on the porch afterward for a long time, turning that phone call over, unable to name exactly what had bothered me about it, only that something had. The third time, the one that mattered most, was the night itself. It was a Tuesday, March the 11th, 9:40 in the evening, and I was on my porch finishing a chess game against myself when I felt a pressure in my chest that I recognized immediately and professionally, the way you recognize a voice on the phone before the person even says hello. I've watched that pressure kill men 20 years younger than me. I called 911 myself, gave the dispatcher my own pulse rate because I was already counting it. And I called Priya from the ambulance at 10:04 because some part of me, even then, wanted my daughter to be the one who showed up. She got to the hospital at 11:20, 40 minutes after the ER had already called her twice, at 10:47 and again at 11:03. Both calls she let go to voicemail because, as she told the nurse when she finally walked in, she'd been in a work call she genuinely could not step out of. When she did arrive, Dr. Alan Feng, the attending that night, met her at the desk to explain that I needed an urgent cardiac catheterization, that I was stable but time-sensitive, and that given the after-hours scheduling, the hospital needed a bridge authorization of $15,000 to move me into the cath lab immediately rather than wait for standard morning insurance processing. Priya looked at the paperwork. Then she looked past Dr. Feng toward the curtain where I was lying, and she said the sentence that opened this story. "Nobody's coming for you in that ambulance, Dad. We're not paying for a hero complex." She laughed a little when she said it. Not cruelly, exactly. More like she was performing exasperation for an audience that happened that night to include her own father on a gurney 12 feet away. I heard every word. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and drop your thoughts in the comments. Here's what Priya didn't know. Standing at that desk at 11:22 on a Tuesday night, she didn't know that a nurse named Ruth Kessler was on shift that night. The same Ruth Kessler who had scrubbed in beside me for 20 years at Cincinnati Children's before moving to the main ER. The same Ruth who had held Adayeze's hand in a different hospital room 3 years earlier when I couldn't make myself do it. Ruth heard the whole exchange from 6 feet away, and Ruth Kessler did not wait for a family decision. She walked to the desk, pulled out her own credit card, and authorized the $15,000 bridge payment herself on the spot at 11:26 p.m., telling Dr. Feng flatly, "Get him upstairs. I'll sort the money out later." She didn't ask Priya's permission. She didn't ask mine. I went into the cath lab at 11:41. I was awake for parts of it, the way you sometimes are, watching the monitor the way I used to watch monitors over other men's chests. 2 blockages, one at 80%, opened with stents by a colleague of mine, a woman named Dr. Okonkwo I'd trained 15 years earlier. Somewhere in that fog, it struck me as strange, almost funny in a bleak way, to finally be on this side of the drape after so long standing on the other one. What I didn't know, not yet, was that Priya's sentence in the waiting room had already started a chain of events that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the fact that Ruth Kessler doesn't forget things, and neither does Marcus Whitlow. I woke up in recovery at 4:15 in the morning to Ruth sitting in a chair by the window, still in her scrubs from a shift that had technically ended at midnight. She didn't say much. She just said, "You're going to be fine, Desmond. And your daughter is going to have some questions in a few days that you should be ready for." I asked her what she meant. She wouldn't tell me. She just picked up her phone and made a call I couldn't hear, standing in the doorway with her back to me. Even through the anesthesia fog, I had the distinct sense that my oldest friend in that building was setting something in motion I had no say in. I spent 4 days in that hospital, in a room on the 4th floor with a window facing the parking garage instead of the river. The kind of room they give patients who aren't dying but aren't quite finished either. The nights were the hardest part, not from pain. The stents had handled that well enough, but from the particular helplessness of lying in a bed at 3 a.m. listening to a heart monitor count out a rhythm you spent your whole career reading on other people's charts and never once expected to hear measuring your own mortality out loud in beeps. A nurse I didn't recognize, young, maybe 26, checked my vitals every 4 hours and called me Dr. Okafor with a kind of reverence that made me feel simultaneously important and completely irrelevant, the way retirement does to a man who spent 4 decades being needed in a very specific, very urgent way. Priya visited twice. The first time, she stood at the foot of the bed for 11 minutes, checked her phone 4 times that I counted, and said, "I'm glad you're okay, Dad. That was scary," in the tone people use when they're reading a card they didn't write. The second visit, the day before discharge, she brought flowers from a gas station and said the sentence I've come to think of as the second version of that refrain. I didn't mean it like that at the hospital. It just came out wrong. "You know how work has been." I told her it was fine. It wasn't fine. But I've learned at 70 that the difference between confronting someone and simply watching them is sometimes just patience. What I didn't tell her, because I still didn't know it myself, was that on my second night in that hospital, Marcus Whitlow had come to visit me under the pretense of bringing paperwork about my will, and instead sat down, closed the door, and told me something that changed the next 11 days of my life. "Desmond," he said, "the hospital foundation board called me yesterday. They're doing a 20-year retrospective gala for the cardiac wing in 10 days. They want to finally, publicly, name the anonymous donor. They've been asking for years and you've always said no. I think, given what just happened in that waiting room 3 nights ago, you should say yes this time." I asked him how he knew what happened in the waiting room. He said Ruth Kessler had called him at 4:20 that same morning. Let me be clear about something, because this isn't a story about me deciding to punish my daughter. That was never the plan, not really. What actually happened is that I asked Marcus one question, and his answer told me everything I needed to know about how deep this had gone without me noticing. I asked him, "Does Priya know anything about the gala? Is she involved in it at all?" And Marcus told me that Priya's employer, the retail company where she works as marketing director, had recently signed on as a corporate sponsor for that exact gala, largely because Priya herself had pitched the partnership internally 3 months earlier as a way to build the company's local philanthropic image. She was, in fact, scheduled to speak for 90 seconds on stage that night on behalf of her employer about the importance of community-minded giving. She had pitched a gala honoring a fund she had no idea her own father had built, to be held in a wing she had, 4 nights earlier, told her father she wouldn't pay ambulance fees to reach. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I told Marcus, yes, let them name the donor. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a hospital room at that hour, the kind where you can hear the compressor on the vending machine down the hall and nothing else. And I remember lying there thinking about Adaeze, about the year we lost our second daughter, about every dinner party where someone thanked me too loudly for money I never wanted credit for, and I thought for the first time in 22 years, maybe I don't mind being seen this time. Maybe it's time. But there was still a question sitting underneath all of it that I couldn't answer yet, one that kept me up more than the chest pain did. If Priya had let this slide this far, the missed calls, the missed appointment, the sentence at the desk, what else had I not been paying attention to? Ruth wouldn't tell me everything she knew. And Marcus, when I asked him directly whether there was more to Priya's financial situation than I understood, only said, "Let's get you home first, Desmond. There's a piece of this that isn't mine to tell you yet." That piece turned out to matter more than I expected. 6 days before the gala, Eleanor Ruiz called me directly, something she'd apparently never done in 22 years of managing an anonymous account. She asked carefully how much I wanted said on stage, whether I wanted my name mentioned at all or simply the fund's title, whether there were details I wanted included or left out entirely. What I wanted was Adaeze's name spoken out loud in that building, in front of people, for the first time in the fund's history. My own name I could take or leave. I said something to Marcus afterward that I still think is true, that I wasn't doing this to be seen. I was doing it because a version of my family had apparently decided I was worth less than I was, and the only honest way to correct a misunderstanding like that is with the truth, delivered plainly, in a room where it can't be argued with. Marcus asked me once the night before whether I was sure, whether some quieter conversation with Priya over dinner in private might accomplish the same thing without an audience. I told him I'd tried quiet for 2 years. Quiet was how we'd gotten here. Over the next several days, recovering at home with a nurse checking in twice, I started putting a few things together myself, the way you do when a case doesn't sit right and you keep turning it over. I remembered back in January, Priya mentioning offhand that Derek's company had restructured, a word people use when they mean something worse. I remembered a comment at Thanksgiving about them simplifying their lease. I remembered 3 weeks before my heart attack, Priya asking, almost too casually, whether I'd ever considered updating my estate plan, given that I was getting older, and it might be smart to simplify things now rather than later. I called Marcus. I asked him directly, was my daughter in financial trouble, and had she been positioning herself around my estate? Marcus was quiet for a second too long before he answered, which told me the answer before he said a word. He confirmed that Derek's company had, in fact, laid off most of its staff in January and was 3 months behind on its office lease. He confirmed that Priya had called his office twice in February, asking general questions about how my estate was structured, questions Marcus, bound by attorney-client privilege to me and me alone, had declined to answer in any detail. 3 days after I got home, I drove myself, against every instruction from my cardiologist, to Marcus's office on 4th Street downtown, the same wood-paneled suite he'd occupied since 1998. He laid out the actual numbers for the first time. Derek's company had raised $900,000 across 2 funding rounds and burned through nearly all of it by that January, missing payroll twice before the layoffs, and personally guaranteeing the office lease under his and Priya's joint name, a detail Priya herself may not have fully understood the exposure of when she signed it back in 2023. Marcus had pieced this together, not by digging, he was careful to tell me, but because 2 of his estate planning colleagues downtown had fielded quiet calls from Priya in the same 6-week window, one about simplifying a parent's assets, another about how quickly an inheritance typically clears probate in Ohio. Nobody had done anything illegal. That was the part that unsettled me most. Nothing about what Priya had done broke a single law. It had simply, slowly, stopped looking like love. I asked Marcus one more question that night, one I hadn't let myself ask yet. Did Ruth know all of this back in the ER, the night of the 11th when she pulled out her own card without waiting for Priya to decide anything? Marcus said he didn't know for certain, but he reminded me that Ruth Kessler had been the charge nurse on that unit for 6 years, and charge nurses see the same handful of warning signs over and over. Families who hover and families who calculate, and that Ruth had told him once, years earlier, that she could usually tell the difference within about 90 seconds of watching someone in a waiting room. I thought about that for a long time after I left his office. 90 seconds. That was apparently all it had taken Ruth to understand something about my own daughter that had taken me 2 years to see. I went to see Ruth myself the following weekend, at her small house in Norwood, the first time I'd been inside it in probably a decade, maybe longer. I honestly couldn't tell you the last occasion. She made tea neither of us drank and told me the rest of what happened that night, the parts she hadn't said in the hospital room. She told me that when Priya first walked up to the desk before the sentence, before any of it, Priya had asked Dr. Feng how long the $15,000 hold would typically take to clear if she used her own card instead, a question that suggested for a moment she might actually authorize it. Ruth said she watched Priya's face do the math out loud, watched her calculate against whatever Derek's failing business had already drained from their accounts that month, and watched the number lose. She wasn't a monster, Desmond, Ruth told me. She was scared and broke and 31 years too proud to say either of those things to her own father. I've seen it before. I just wasn't going to let you pay for it with your life while she worked it out. I asked Ruth why she never told me any of this in the 20 years we'd worked together, that she was capable of reading a room that fast. She said, "You never asked me to read your family, Desmond. You asked me to read hearts. Turns out it's the same skill." 2 days after that, I asked Marcus to arrange a short conversation with Dr. Alan Feng, mostly to satisfy my own need for precision, the old surgeon's habit of wanting every timestamp confirmed twice. Feng walked me through the chart himself, the 2 missed calls at 10:47 and 11:03, Priya's arrival logged at 11:20, Ruth's authorization at 11:26, my transfer to the cath lab at 11:41. He also told me something I hadn't known, that he'd documented the exchange at the desk in his own notes that night, not for any legal reason, simply because, in his words, it felt like something someone should remember accurately. Somewhere in that hospital's records, in a doctor's careful clinical language, my daughter's sentence about hero complexes existed as a matter of fact, time-stamped and witnessed, whether she ever wanted it to or not. I want to be fair to my daughter here because this story only works if I am. I don't believe Priya sat down and plotted to let her father die in an ER so she could inherit faster. I don't think that's who she is, even now. I think what actually happened is smaller and sadder than that. which is that money fear had been quietly reshaping how she saw me for 2 years, turning me from her father into a variable in a spreadsheet she was too ashamed to admit she was running. The sentence at the desk wasn't a plan. It was just what falls out of someone when the shame has been sitting there long enough. That didn't mean I was going to pretend it hadn't happened. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. Actually, let me finish first. There's more. 2 nights before the gala, Priya stopped by the house unannounced, which she hadn't done in over a year. She stood in the kitchen doorway, still in her work clothes, and asked if I was planning to go to that hospital thing Thursday. I told her I hadn't decided. She said carefully that Derek's board had asked her to also mention on stage something about family values driving community partnership. And would I mind if she used the line about her father's medical career? Nothing specific, just color for the audience. I said that was fine. She lingered by the door another few seconds, like there was something else sitting behind her teeth, and for a moment I thought she might finally say it, might finally ask why the missed calls that night still hung in the air between us unaddressed. Instead she said, "Anyway, glad you're doing better," and left before I could answer either way. I stood in that kitchen a long time after her car pulled out of the driveway, wondering how close she'd actually come to saying something real, and whether Thursday night was going to answer that question for both of us, whether she was ready or not. The gala was set for the night of March the 22nd at the hospital's main atrium, the same building where I'd spent 38 years and where, 11 days earlier, my daughter had told a nurse I could wait for an ambulance. I was cleared by my cardiologist to attend as long as I didn't overdo it, which is doctor language for behave yourself. And Marcus arranged for me to sit at a table near the back, not on the program, not announced, just an old man in a gray suit that used to fit better before the weight I'd lost that spring. Priya didn't know I was coming. She assumed, reasonably, that a man 11 days out from a heart catheterization wouldn't be standing around a fundraiser in a rented tuxedo shirt drinking sparkling water out of a glass that looked like champagne. I let her assume that. The atrium had been transformed for the night. String lights strung between the steel beams I remembered from the original 2003 construction walkthrough. Round tables draped in white linen arranged around the same glass wall that used to be my view during early morning rounds. I sat at table 14 near the exit with a place card that simply read D. Okafor. No title, no explanation, exactly the way I'd asked Marcus to arrange it. I watched her arrive at 6:45 in a navy dress, laughing with 2 women from Derek's investor circle, moving through the atrium the way people move when they've decided a room is exactly their size. At 7:10, I watched her stop near the dessert table with 3 people I didn't recognize, and I heard her say, clear enough to catch from 4 feet away, "Honestly, my dad's generation just wasn't built for this kind of money. We're comfortable. We're not, gala donor comfortable." One of the women laughed. Priya laughed too. At 7:22, Derek found her near the bar, and I watched him check his watch twice. The particular fidget of a man whose company folded 11 weeks earlier, trying to look comfortable in a room full of people who might still write him a check. Neither of them looked toward table 14. Neither of them had any reason to yet. That was the third version of the refrain, though she didn't know she was saying it. Not the exact words, but the same idea, dressed up for a different room. We're not paying for a hero complex. We're not gala donor comfortable. Same sentence, softer coat. At 7:35, the hospital foundation's board chair, a woman named Eleanor Ruiz, took the small stage near the atrium's glass wall and began the 20-year retrospective presentation on the cardiac wing. She talked about survival rate improvements, about the 17,000 patients treated there over 2 decades, and then she said the sentence the entire room, including my daughter, was waiting to hear. For 22 years, this hospital has been the beneficiary of a single anonymous endowment that built this wing from the ground up. Tonight, at the donor's request, we are honored to finally share that this fund has always been known internally as the Adeze Okafor Cardiac Care Endowment, established in memory of a woman who understood, better than most, what it costs a family to lose someone to a heart that gave out too soon. The screen behind her changed. It showed a photograph of Adayeze, the one from our 30th anniversary, and beneath it, a single line, established and funded in full by Dr. Desmond Okafor. I want you to understand the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with applause. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet right before it turns into something else entirely. Priya's head turned first toward the screen, then, slowly, toward the back tables, scanning, the way people do when a name they know suddenly doesn't fit the shape they expected. It took her 4 full seconds to find me. I know because I was counting, the same way I count everything, out of habit, out of 38 years of training myself to notice exact numbers in a crisis. She found me sitting alone at a round table near the exit, in a suit that hung a little loose on a body that had lost 11 pounds in 11 days, and I watched every version of her face happen at once. Confusion first, then something like math being done very fast. Then, underneath all of it, something that looked almost like grief, the particular kind that comes from realizing you've been standing next to something enormous for years and calling it small. I didn't stand up. I didn't wave. I let Eleanor Ruiz finish her remarks, let the applause happen, watched 300 people turn their glasses and their attention toward a man in the back who had never once in 22 years wanted a single one of them to look at him like that. Derek found Priya's arm before she could move toward me. I watched him say something low, and I watched her shake her head, not at him, at the whole room like she was trying to physically clear it. She reached my table 4 minutes later. She didn't sit down. She stood there in her navy dress with her drink still in her hand, and the first thing she said wasn't sorry. It was, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I told her the truth. I said, "Because the first time I gave that hospital money after we lost your sister, someone thanked me in front of a room full of people, and I decided that night I never wanted to be thanked for grief again." It was never about you not knowing, Priya. It was about me needing it to stay quiet. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said the 4th version of the refrain, and this one, finally, meant something different than the first 3. "I told the nurse we weren't paying for your hero complex, and it turns out you'd already paid for half this room without telling anyone." She wasn't laughing this time. I didn't say anything clever back to her. I just said, "Sit down, Priya. Your feet must be tired in those shoes." She sat. For a while, neither of us said anything, and I let the silence sit there instead of rushing to fill it. The way I used to let a family sit quietly in a consultation room before hard news, because rushing past silence rarely helps anyone hear what comes next. Finally, she asked, "Were you ever going to tell me? If none of this had happened, if I'd never said what I said, would I have gone my whole life not knowing?" I thought about softening it. I didn't. "Probably," I said. "I made peace with that a long time ago. It was never about keeping something from you, Priya. It was about a promise I made myself the year we lost your sister, that I'd never let this family's grief turn into something people applauded me for." "I've thought about what I said every day since it happened," she said, her voice lower now. "I keep trying to explain it to myself, and none of the explanations make it sound like anything other than what it was." "I know about Derek's company," I told her. "I know some of why you said it wasn't really about me at all. That doesn't undo it, and I'm not going to pretend it does. But I'd rather understand where it came from than just carry the anger forever." She turned her glass slowly on the tablecloth for a long moment. "I don't know how to be your daughter and someone managing a falling apart budget at the same time," she finally said. "I think I've been trying to do both since Mom died, and I picked wrong more than once." "Then stop picking," I said. "Just be my daughter. We'll sort the rest of it out slower than tonight. We didn't fix everything that night. I'll say that plainly, because stories that wrap up too neatly stop being useful to anyone listening who's living through something similar. What we did was smaller and, I think, more real." Eleanor Ruiz, at Marcus's quiet suggestion earlier that week, had also arranged a short recognition for Ruth Kessler, calling her up to reimburse the $15,000 she'd put on her own card 11 days earlier, and to thank her by name in front of the same 300 people for the 15 years she'd spent in that ER. Ruth cried. I hadn't seen her cry since Adayeze's funeral. The story didn't stay inside that room either, though I hadn't planned for that part. A local news reporter covering the gala for a philanthropy segment picked up on the retrospective naming, and by the following Monday, a short piece ran with the headline naming the endowment and the surgeon behind it, mentioning almost in passing that his daughter worked in marketing for a regional retailer that had sponsored the same event. Priya told me later that 3 separate colleagues forwarded her the article that week with variations of the same question, some version of "why didn't you ever mention your dad basically funded a hospital wing?" And she didn't have an answer that didn't require explaining the sentence she'd said in that waiting room. So, mostly, she just said she hadn't known either, which was true, and left it there. The business side of what happened afterward is short, so I'll say it in one sentence. The foundation formally retitled the fund in Adayeze's name going forward, with a small committee, including Priya, invited to help direct a portion of its annual grants toward family cardiac support services, the kind of bridge payment assistance that might have made that night at the ER unnecessary in the first place. The human side took longer. Priya and I started having dinner every other Thursday, just the two of us. No Derek, no investors. At a diner near my house that Adayeze used to like. The first few were quiet, careful, the kind of conversations where you're both still deciding how much to say. By the fourth one, in April, she started asking me real questions about my mother, about my career, about her sister, questions she'd never once asked in 41 years. And I found myself, at 70, telling a version of my own life story to my daughter for what felt like the first time. Derek's company folded that summer. Priya didn't ask me for money. I offered anyway, a small amount, structured through Marcus, not as rescue, but as what I'd call ordinary fatherhood. The kind that had nothing to do with hero complexes or fund endowments, just a man helping his daughter the way he probably should have been doing all along, quietly, without anyone needing to thank him for it. In May, Priya asked if she could come to one of my cardiology follow-ups, not to drive me this time. I could drive myself again by then, but just to sit in the waiting room with me. She didn't say much during the appointment. Afterward, over lunch at a diner 2 blocks from the clinic, she told me, unprompted, that she'd started seeing a therapist in April, and that one of the first things she'd said out loud in that office was the sentence from the ER waiting room, and how long it had taken her to say it without immediately excusing herself for it. I didn't tell her it was fine this time. I just told her I was glad she was saying it somewhere. Every Tuesday morning, Priya meets me, now at Sydney's, on Erie Avenue at 8:15. She orders a latte. I order the same drip coffee I've ordered for years. Bethany, behind the counter, knows both our orders now. There's a chessboard on my porch that's been missing an opponent since Adayeze died. Priya doesn't know how to play. I've started teaching her on Sunday afternoons. Badly, both of us. And there's something in watching her lose a match slowly. Thinking it through instead of rushing the way she used to rush everything. That tells me more about how she's changing than any apology ever could. Derek found work in June, an operations role at a mid-sized logistics company. Nothing glamorous, nothing that photographs well for a business page. And I noticed Priya stopped describing things in terms of what they looked like to other people. By August, she'd left her marketing director role for a smaller nonprofit position, closer to the hospital foundation work she'd stumbled into that spring, a pay cut she told me about matter-of-factly over coffee instead of dressing it up as a strategic career move. This past November, we had Thanksgiving at my house instead of hers for the first time in 6 years. No investors at the table, no business partners, just Priya, Derek, Ruth Kessler, who I've started inviting to things now that Adayeze isn't here to do it for me, and Marcus, who complained the whole meal that I still hadn't updated my will the way he'd been asking for a decade. Priya stood up halfway through dinner, glass in hand, and said she wanted to say something, and I watched her look around the table the way she'd looked around that gala 8 months earlier, except this time there was nothing underneath the expression except the truth of it. She said she was grateful her father was still at this table to complain about the mashed potatoes and that she didn't take that for granted anymore. Nobody laughed. Nobody needed to. I think about that sentence sometimes. We're not paying for a hero complex. I've come to believe it wasn't cruelty that made her say it. It was fear wearing a joke as a disguise, the way fear so often does in families that don't know how to say the real thing out loud. I don't think you fix a sentence like that with one gala, one reveal, one dramatic evening under bright lights. You fix it slowly, on ordinary Tuesdays, one coffee at a time, one clumsy chess move at a time, until the person across the table starts to feel less like a line item and more like your father again. I still keep Adaeze's reading glasses on the nightstand. I haven't moved them, and I don't think I ever will, but the house doesn't feel quite as empty as it did in March. Priya has a key now, something she never had while her mother was alive because Adaeze always managed that kind of thing, and she uses it most Sundays, letting herself in around 10 with coffee from somewhere that isn't Sydney's, which I complain about every single time. I think a lot these days about how close I came to never telling anyone about that fund at all, about how easily this could have stayed a private arrangement between me and a lawyer, unraveling quietly the day I died instead of the day I lived. I think about how the sentence that nearly broke something between my daughter and me is the same sentence that ended up fixing it, which isn't the kind of tidy lesson I'd have believed in before this year, but there it is anyway. Adaeze used to say that the truest thing a person could do for someone they loved was show up quietly and let the loving speak for itself. I spent 22 years doing that for a hospital full of strangers. It took a heart attack, an ambulance, and a room full of people looking at the back table to finally do it for my own daughter. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one. Kich Ban Huan Chin. Voiceover Sach San Sang Copy Thang Vao 11 Labs/Bark/TTS Kong brackets Kong notes Tong Tu 7351 Dembang WC-WW Không ước lượng ước tính runtime approximately 46 to 47 foot 155 to 160 W.P.M.